Hey guys, welcome back to We Met at Acme. I'm so excited to be here with marriage and family therapist and the author of The Origins of You, Vienna Pharaon. Hi,
Hi, thanks for having me.
thanks for being here. Before we get into anything, Vienna, what is your favorite romantic gesture?
Mm, Anything that is just a thoughtful moment that has is not attached to anything else. Like I thought of you and brought this small thing back for you. I think just those moments of you were in my mind when just like randomly throughout the
Mm-hmm.
day or the week or the month are so meaningful. And I think like years in, you can forget about that because you just are in your routine.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate those moments when there's just like a thoughtful consideration, small stuff.
I love that too. I feel like every time I go like grocery shopping, for
Mhm.
example, I'm like, what's something that I can get that is like so small and
Yeah,
silly, like a little candy
right.
that I know my husband will be like so excited about.
Yeah.
And then like I'll come home or when he gets home, I'll be like, there's surprises, like look for them.
That's cute.
I don't know if I'll keep doing it after we have
You might
kids.
get a little tired.
Yeah,
Yeah.
maybe I'll but we'll see. I love that. And what is your current relationship status?
Married to a wonderful partner, Connor. Um, we've been together now for about 7.5 years.
How did you guys meet?
We met through a mutual best friend. I was out in Vancouver actually speaking, and yeah, there's like a little bit of a backstory to it because we had crossed paths prior, but he was speaking at the same conference ultimately that I was speaking at. And yeah, like it was long distance. I was in New York, he was in Vancouver, but he would fly back and forth because he could for work. He would fly back and forth every couple of weeks and stay here for about 10 days to 14 days each time, and then eventually got him to come to the East Coast. He always is trying to get me back to Vancouver.
Mhm.
But yeah, I mean the full long distance courtship for a while. It's
That's
no
tough.
joke. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really tough. And is he also a therapist?
He's in this area. He works with men. He runs a men's mental health organization called Man Talks, and yeah, he does deep like Jungian shadow work.
Mhm.
He's really one of the most beautiful practitioners I've ever seen work, especially with men. And so yeah, in deep admiration of the work that he does. But it's people are always like, wow, I wonder what it's like to be at home with the two of you.
Right.
Like, are you constantly, analyzing each other? And we're not. But I think to be in a relationship where there's a sense of introspection and reflection, and we know each other's stories so well, and
Mhm.
we know each other's families, like the way that both of us grew up and the things that were painful for us. And I think we do such a beautiful job holding those stories, like our history, each other's history, as we move through life, present day. And I find that to be so important in relationships where it's like, yeah, like I know your history, and I think of you at times as like a little human who was going through, a family system that had its flaws to it.
Right.
And I can keep that in mind. Especially when like through hardship. I think the easy times are like, great, we're enjoying each other. This is easy. This is fun. But when there's conflict or when there's, some type of friction, to be able to remember that we have a history and it's complicated and it has layers to it. And so I'm not just thinking about the person who's in front of me right now. I'm thinking about, your entire history and what's playing out in this moment from before. That's yeah, there's beautiful work that happens there.
Totally. And something I actually wanted to ask you about, especially so you are parents
Yeah.
of a 3-year-old.
Yeah.
And I read this article recently, I think it was in the Cut, about gentle parenting
Mhm.
and kind of like what's better, right? Like
Mhm.
the way that we were parented, and obviously I'm generalizing, but
Right.
if are you a millennial? Do you consider
Yeah,
yourself a millennial?
I'm how old am I now? I'm 38.
Okay, so
Yeah.
same. I'm not
I have to
38, but
count, but I'm like, yeah, that's
yeah,
that's
yeah,
my
yeah.
age
But
now.
I'm in the same like
Yeah.
range of
Yep.
millennial. And I feel like there's just so many jokes online about like how we were parent like how our parents were just like, deal with it. Like we're
Mhm.
going to this, like, it is what it is, stop
Right.
crying, whatever. And now I see all of these like let your like, if your kid is crying, they're not trying to manipulate you. They
Mhm.
really need something. Be gentle. Just all of this stuff I'm
Mhm.
absorbing because I'm about to be a parent
Yeah.
myself. And I saw this article and it basically was saying, you know, gentle parenting is maybe not so great.
Mm.
Do you have any thoughts on that? And, obviously working with parents and families and things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think anything in its extreme is probably, yeah, it's probably too much leaning, in one direction, and I also think it's probably something that's hard to keep up at all times in every moment. I think there's beautiful parts to gentle parenting, of course, that, allow for, the full expression of emotion and, being able to tolerate that as the adult in the relationship. And I also know that, as a parent myself, there's a limit to it. There's only so far, and bless the people who can do it, 24/7. But there's like a point in time where I do think that, sometimes, and that doesn't have to mean like harsh parenting, right? Like
Mhm.
it's not, the opposite of it isn't harshness, but I think there's yeah, like I think it can lean sometimes too far in that direction, if we don't have boundaries with it, if there's no consequence, and so, yeah, I think it's finding some type of middle ground there. But I do think seeing our children as like whole individuals who are not necessarily just fitting into our lives is really important. Like we are collaborating together, right? I'm learning how to fit into your life. You're learning how to fit into my life. And I'm trying to hold this space to understand the full, like complex individual who is in front of me, even though you've only been around for a short amount of time. But I think I get asked the question so often, like, oh, especially after people read my book and they're like, I'm going to wound my children, like, like, is there a way to avoid that? And there isn't. I think there's a way to try to protect our children from the big traumatic stuff and to do our best to be, vigilant and looking out for those things. But at the end of the day, we're humans who are going to be imperfect, who are going to disappoint and say the wrong thing, get something wrong from time to time. And obviously, we want to minimize that as much as possible. But what I find to be really important is not the absence of challenge or hardship or, even if we get upset with a child in a moment, right, where we are a bit more reactive than we'd like to be, it's a race to repair as parents, right? So it's not like, oh my gosh, I'll never not be gentle. I have to be gentle at all moments. Like we are going to be human. I really believe that. I think it's important. I think it's also important that our children don't grow up in a vacuum, right? Where there's like no challenge whatsoever and no hardship whatsoever for them to learn that it's okay to get through a hard thing together. I think that's the beauty of the parent-child relationship is to get through hard things together, to see that that person is on the other side of this moment where we get upset with them or they've drawn on the walls that we've just painted, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And I think it's this idea of getting to a place of ownership and accountability as quickly as possible. I don't work with kids, but I work with adults who have all been kids before. And, one of the things that I hear time and time again is how much people just wish that a parent could acknowledge something. We don't have to go back. We don't have to change what happened, right? We know that we can't, but I just want to have an acknowledgement or an ownership, or that there's such a release there. And I think, to be parents and the new ones out there, right, with the littles, it's like, we have to be able to hold ourselves up in high enough regard as adults in order to be able to say, I'm sorry, or let me take accountability for that. Because otherwise, we enter into a shame spiral where we have to self protect instead of relationally protect, right? Instead of being able to understand the experience of our child, right? I'm having to protect the shame that I'm going through right now or the embarrassment that I'm feeling. And when we're doing self protection, we can't do relational protection.
That's really interesting. I
Yeah.
never thought about it like that, but that's such a good point.
Yeah.
Like, 'Cause I've experienced that even in my relationship with my husband, like, when I feel bad that I did something that he's calling me out
Yeah.
for, like, I'm reacting to the fact that I'm mad at myself, not
Mhm.
the fact that I upset him.
Oh, totally. And that's I mean, I work with couples a lot, and this idea of feedback, is a really important one because we have to be able to tolerate feedback in our relationships, right? We have to be able to withstand that. Otherwise, we're not going to grow very much and we're not going to get very far. But feedback is often coded as criticism, right? And it's something that we can very quickly move into a shame spiral or guilt or embarrassment. And this practice of being able to still see ourselves as worthy, valuable human beings who maybe did do something that was hurtful or disrespectful to someone else, but I can like hold myself up so that I can actually hear you. Because if I'm not holding myself up, then I have to self protect. And
Right.
it's just something that creates disconnection in our relationships, whether it's children, whether it's a partner, whether it's a friend, whomever. But it's like it's a disconnector as opposed to being a connector. And I think it's one of the skill sets, that's it really is emotional maturity, right? To like get to a place where I can hear your feedback and still think nicely of myself, right? Like I
Mhm.
can still say like, "Oh yeah, shoot, I did do that." Um, and I want to hear about you and I want to tune into your experience instead of needing to tune into my own. It's hard work, but it's a
Yeah.
really beautiful goal.
Yeah. I
Yeah.
think we can all work on that more, myself definitely included. Um, and, like, with kind of like, you know, on breaking family patterns and things
Mhm.
like that. I have heard, obviously, you're not gonna, just because you weren't parented perfectly doesn't mean you're now all of a sudden gonna be the perfect parent.
Mhm.
Obviously, you said this too, like, we're human, we're all gonna mess up.
Yeah.
The goal is to maybe mess up a little less than our parents and so on and so forth. Um, but when we have these, family patterns, like, for example, as we're going into the idea of being parents, like, something my husband and I talk about all the time is that we want to talk to our kids like adults, like,
Mhm.
from as early as possible.
Mhm.
And I don't know if, like, you hear this and you roll your eyes because you're like, just wait, but I feel like if my kid is crying, instead of me like, oh, little baby, like, it's
Mhm.
okay, I'm gonna be like, what's making you sad,
Mhm.
you know? But I don't know. Or just like, I don't even know if this is an actual memory from my family growing up or if I'm, like, just making this up, but, like, let's say I was crying and then my parents would be like, "You're fine." Like, So it's like, finding that medium of, like,
Yeah.
what is making you upset versus you're fine or, "Oh, it's okay. I'm gonna protect you," like, no
Yeah, it's
matter
like
what
when
it
you
is.
first started speaking, I was like, "Oh, I wonder if your experience as a kiddo was, maybe feeling a little bit more invalidated or there wasn't space for it. Oh, you're gonna be fine, you're gonna be fine," which we understand why parents used to say something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and right, it like eliminates the space for us to feel like we're checked in on, right? To feel like somebody actually cares about what is happening inside of my body right now. And so this part of you that's wanting to yeah, correct that because as a kid, like I know you said maybe I don't know if I have this memory for sure or not, but right, there's some sense there that you didn't necessarily feel like there was an opening for your full expression of your emotion or that the your parents or the adults in your life were really able to like tolerate the emotion that was there or even know what to do with it. And
Mhm.
I don't know if that resonates with you, but I think for so many people, it's like you grow up in a family system where, yeah, of course we have emotion, right? Of course we have a wide range of feelings. And if we don't have adult figures in our lives who know how to hold that and meet that, right? Without having to tamper with it, right? Without having to minimize it or maximize it or distort it in any way, then we don't feel like it's safe for us to bring it forward. And then maybe we become parents ourselves and we're like, okay, I'm going to make sure that there is absolutely room for you to have whatever emotions you're feeling, which sounds like a really beautiful shift. But I think it's great and important to understand like why we want to make those changes, right? Because sometimes the 180 is fantastic. And sometimes the 180 is like in opposition to something that our parents did that isn't necessarily integrated.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really interesting. What are your thoughts on talking to a child like an adult?
I mean, I don't even know that the way that you described it didn't even really sound like talking to an adult. It was like,
Mhm.
yeah, like, tell me about what you're experiencing. Like, I
Mhm.
think that that's beautiful. I think that kids do respond to that. And, I think we don't necessarily name what it is we think that they're experiencing, but I do that with my son, right? I'm like, okay, sure. Like, tell me what you're feeling right now. I
Mhm.
want to hear about it.
Yeah.
And it's like that becomes the way that we engage, even though, of course, like they might not be able to engage with us that way from the get go. Like you might be talking to your newborn who's
Right.
not going to be saying much back
Right.
to you, but you are still creating a framework with them that says, I'm curious, I'm interested, I want to hear about this, and I can tolerate what it is that you're going to share with me, right? Like I can
Yeah.
withstand it. Your sadness is not gonna destroy me, right?
Mhm.
Like, your anger, your frustration isn't going to disrupt me in such a significant way that I can't be present for you, right?
Right. Right. And I think there's also like, I have friends whose parents maybe were like too open about like
Mhm.
when they were going through hard times or
Yeah.
things like that, right? But then I also have friends, I actually have these two little girls in my life. They're so great.
Oh,
And I love their parents and they are so advanced. Like they can talk about politics. They're 10 and 13.
wow.
Like they can really go there. And we always ask their parents, like, how did this happen?
Mhm.
And they're like, well, we just like explain things to
Mm,
them. Like when we're, talking to each other and they're like, what are you talking about? We will explain it to
yeah.
them instead of being like, oh, you don't need to think about that.
Mhm.
And that's something that I definitely wish that I had more of growing up because I feel like I went to school and I had no idea what was going I had no idea, like, really who was president, like, I didn't know any of that stuff, and I feel like parents are so afraid to, like, go there with their kids because 'cause they're like, "I don't wanna, like, put them like, make them depressed or,
Mhm.
I don't wanna this," but I feel like you'd be more depressed if you didn't know anything that was going on in the world,
Mhm.
and then all of a sudden it hit you, like, through something else.
Yeah, I mean, I think again that framework of I want you to trust and know that we can go through hard things together,
Yeah.
right, as parent child. So if
Mhm.
there is something really hard that's happening in the world right now, and yeah, like it's age appropriate, right? Then we're going to move through this together. And, I think obviously we also want to protect, their innocence at different points, depending on their age, and allow them to be in the playfulness, right? And not have them necessarily grow up too quickly or feel like they have to be an adult when they're actually a child. But I think that there's something really beautiful that you're describing, which is just like, I see you as a whole human, right? And yeah, I'm going to choose which things I think are age appropriate for you to understand and learn about. And maybe that's going to be a wider, cast net for you than maybe what your parents offered to you. Where you're like, when you reflect back, like I could have handled more of this, and I, in fact, would have really liked to know more stuff.
Mhm.
And I think that approach feels like a very thoughtful and considerate one as you enter into this new chapter and stage, and you're gonna just, like, learn so much on the job, you know?
Totally, I know, I feel like
We have
that's
ideas
like
before they come, and then you're
uh-huh.
like, figure it out
Right,
as they're
and I'm
here.
sure, like, most things will go out the window. I'd love to pivot a little bit just to talking about relationships, and one question that came up, which I love, is what are some good habits to create early on in marriage?
Yeah. I mean, I think appreciation and gratitude, as like basic as it might sound, is one of the things that just has to be a part of the conversation. It's so easy. I've worked with a lot of people at this point. I've seen been in a lot of hours of therapy, and the amount of people who get to a place of resentment in their relationships over the years is really high, and there's like lots of like disconnection that happens. And I think one of the reasons that we arrive there is because we don't acknowledge each other anymore. We don't see each other, right? We don't appreciate each other. We take a lot of the things that happen in the day to day for granted. And so I think a very simple practice is being in deep acknowledgement of our partners, and asking for that in return. All of us as humans, like to be seen, to be heard, to be understood, like it's so powerful. It's not like, again, I know it sounds a little basic and maybe even corny to some, but there's a reason why we say this, right? It's like there's a reason why, okay, seen, heard, understood, right? Because it like actually matters, because it actually is meaningful for us as individuals to be witnessed by someone else and to feel that we are making an impression on them for the things that we do. And when you're with somebody for an extended period of time and you're not just in that honeymoon phase in the early parts, oh my gosh, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Like constantly in that space, right? It's like, yeah, the little stuff we just forget about. It's like, oh, well, we have to do that. Well, we don't have to do that. Right? We do it because maybe it's our routine and it's the way that we like things and this is how we operate in the world. But a sense of acknowledgement, I think, is a really important thing to practice. Um, I would say maybe twice a year, my partner and I, we sit down and we just sort of take a pulse check on the relationship. We do it for our careers as well, where it's like, where do we want to grow? What feedback do you have for me? And I think there's something, as we were saying before, this idea of creating space for feedback. How am I as a partner to you? Ugh. Like that's a hard question to ask. But if you're brave enough to do it and you have a partner who's willing to share, honestly and openly, I think there's a beautiful opportunity for growth there. And so a brave practice that I'd say is asking that question, like, how have I been as a partner to you? And, maybe that's something that we do, yeah, like once a month, or,
Mhm.
that doesn't have to be a daily thing. That'll be moving all around on the spectrum. But yeah, like how have I been as a partner this past month? Like I want to hear what it's been like for you to be with me.
And what if the other person is just like, "You've been great."
Yeah.
Then what? Like, and they truly mean that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. I mean, so maybe we can accept that if it does feel like we've been showing up as a good partner. Um, I think it's hard to accept that as truth if we know that we haven't. And I think sometimes we're like, I want you to dig in, like tell me how you really feel. Give me the like real stuff. And if we have people who are like a people pleaser or someone who struggles to disappoint another, or someone who, I was this person, I was a I'm fine person for decades of my life. And so this idea of being able to say, yeah, like I'm not fine or this is not feeling good was a deep, deep, deep threat to me and my relationships. And so this is a beautiful question because I think a lot of people can probably resonate with either being the person who struggles to say, actually, this isn't going well for me. And I didn't like how you treated me this month, or I didn't like what went down a couple weeks ago. Or if we're on the other side where we know that we're behaving in such a way that isn't A plus, but we have a partner who is, protecting something and not able to actually share that. Like, eh, this is a inquiry for the individual who needs to express the thing. And I think that question of what blocks us from being able to share honestly and openly is going to point us to something that's really important to us. And like I was saying before, for me, I was an individual who moved through life just kind of flying under the radar, pretending like I was fine. I grew up in my parents went through a 9-year divorce process when I was in first grade. I'm an only child. And so I was this tiny little human in a family system that was really crashing and burning around me. And there was just a lot of like gaslighting and manipulation and psychological abuse and paranoia and just like high, 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 high conflict constantly. And so as a little human, I decided that I was going to be fine and I was going to be okay and I wasn't going to need anything because when I looked around, I saw the adults in my life crashing and burning. And so it was from my point of view, I didn't believe that there was room for me to not be fine. And I share this story because I think not that everybody's story is going to be my story. That's the inquiry, is what is your story when it comes to being able to share truthfully and honestly?
Yeah.
Because I was really scared, obviously that was me as a little girl, but I turned into an adult woman who also pretended to be fine and unaffected by things. And I, was like, the persona was I was the cool girl and I'm down for whatever. And like, yeah, no worries. And, deeply boundaryless. But the threat, right? The thing that I was so afraid of having happen was that if I said I wasn't okay, relationships were going to end, right? That it would break it. Right? This idea from being a tiny little girl in the system, and it's like, oh, they're not okay. And if I'm not okay, it's gonna get worse. And then you fast forward, it's like, okay, if I'm not okay, relationships are going to end or people are not going to want to be with me. And it doesn't have to be a rational thing. It's rarely a rational thing. But I held that as a really deep belief that there wasn't room for me to share that I wasn't okay or I was bothered by things. I would always say, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And so, if anybody resonates with this, I would say to inquire about what the it's fine is trying to protect.
Mhm.
Our behavior is constantly protecting us from something. We make sense in context. Our behavior makes sense in context. It's what's so beautiful about this, is that, our self-protective ways are like, they've been so helpful in our lives. But as adults, right, we get to a place where the protection and the survival that we learned from so long ago generally is going to block us from something that we actually need at this point in our lives: expansion, growth, communication with a partner. And so, yeah, that question's an important one, but it relies on the person who's saying, it's fine, I'm fine, it's great, when we know that something's off. And granted, sometimes it might be fine, right? So we'll take that in the one-off moments, but it requires that person to inquire about what that is protecting, within them. So whether you're a people pleaser, or, you're someone who has to avoid hurting or letting down others or disappointing people because you grew up in a family where, if you felt pressure to keep mom happy all the time, or whatever it was, right? The endless stories. It's going to be something that eliminates a person's ability to share freely
Mhm.
and trust that I can share this and it can be okay.
Right.
At the end, like, to me, at the end of the day, like, that's what's there, is a block that says, I don't believe, not necessarily because of you, because it can very much be historical, but I don't believe that I can share that something is not okay in this moment and that we can see our way through it, or I can see my way through it.
But how far into your relationship
Mhm.
with your husband, let's just use this
Yeah.
relationship as an example, were you able to say, "I'm not fine, actually." You know what I mean? Like, it's not something that you
Yeah.
immediately do, especially if
Right.
it's something that from your childhood is like a pattern, that kind of thing.
Yeah. So I had resolved this before, for the most part, before I had met him. I had a relationship prior to him, that was in my like mid late 20s, where I thought I was going to be with this person. And a couple months in, it was a really intense relationship. So when I say a couple months in, like, we were deep in at that point. Um, it wasn't like New York City dating, like a couple months in where you're like, I've been on 2 dates with this person.
Mhm.
It's like much deeper than that. And his ex came back into the picture, and she wanted to be back with him. And he was contemplating whether or not he wanted to be back in the relationship with her, or he was gonna stay in the relationship with me. And cue it up immediately. I'm like, totally understand. Like, this must be so hard
Oh
for
my
you. Ugh,
god.
right. I know. It's like every time I share this story, I feel like the full cringe comes
Uh-huh.
on. But like, I go into this place, and it's both me as the little girl, the individual I was just telling you, and then also me as therapist who's like, context, and like, there's a story and you're going through hard stuff too. And you merge those two identities and roles together. And this is what you get, right? Is me saying, I get that this is really hard. Like, totally understand. Take all the time you want, blah, blah, blah. You need to spend time with her. Go for it. I'm fine. Blah, 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 blah. Right. And I'm having a conversation with a friend about it. And it all clicks in for me at the moment, where I'm like, Yeah, that's the role, right? Like, that's the same role that I took on as a kid,
Mhm.
and I remember finally having a conversation with the guy I was dating at the time, where I just said, I'm removing myself from, this situation. I'm actually not okay with what's happening, and I feel disrespected, and I feel like a lot of boundaries are being crossed, and they
Mhm.
were. And, like, I'm not okay with what's going on here, and it was the last time that we ever spoke, and, this was not a mic drop moment. I didn't feel deeply empowered afterwards. There were a lot of tears afterwards, but it was a life-changing moment for me. I think for anyone who's ever struggled to say, "I'm not okay, I'm not fine," and then to finally be able to say those words out loud, that is significant. It was profound for me, and that's not hyperbolic. Like, it was a deeply profound moment for me, and from that point on, I don't think I ever really turned back. I think at that point, it was like, "Oh, wow, like, I've been living this way for decades, and it has robbed me of something really significant," right? Like, my voice, my boundaries, my ability to share my preferences. I, like, had 0 preferences. "I'm cool, I'm fine, yeah, sure, whatever." Like, there was no pulse check on anything, and I think the moment that I kind of got off that track and created a new track for myself and survived it and was like, "Oh, like, I'm okay. Everybody's still here." Like, sure, the relationship ended, but all is okay in the world. That gave me a sense of, I guess, eventually a sense of empowerment. And
Mhm.
so that part has not shown up in my relationship, in my marriage, where I do feel confident to be able to express it, but I also have a partner who's able to hear it.
Mhm.
Right? I have somebody who can actually receive feedback and who can hear when I'm upset, even if I'm upset at him, not just upset at something that doesn't have anything to do with him.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, and that's huge. What about the best ways to repair after you've had a fight with your significant other? So, like, obviously, we talked about having these check-in conversations. That's
Yep.
not a fight, that's like a discussion.
Yes.
But fights happen,
Mhm.
and repairing after, I feel like, is more telling than the
Mhm.
fight itself almost, and, like, how you kind of move on from it together. Um, is there obviously, it's not like a one size fits all, but is there something that you share with your patients on just, like, how to best repair things?
Mhm. Yeah. The same way that I was saying about it with the kids before. It's like when we're in conflict with a partner, we tend to race to be right. We tend to race to prove our point. We're like, who can get there first, right? As opposed to a race to actually repair, a race to, like, I'm going to be the first person to actually hear your experience or your perspective. And yeah, it's challenging when we're heightened. I think a lot of the stuff that we do around conflict doesn't tend to happen in the moment. It often happens in the after moments because once we're escalated and up there, we've kind of lost the thread and it's hard to come back. So we need a little bit of time apart. I'll share a personal story. This was before Connor and I were married. We were dating at the time and we were in a conflict. And I have no clue what we were fighting about, but I do know that I was like proving my point and like doubling down and tripling down. I couldn't stop. And he's like, "I got it. I understand what you're saying." And I'm like going and going and going and going. And again, he's like, "I got it. I got it." And I'm having an out of body experience where I'm just like, "Oh my God, stop talking, Vienna. Like, enough." He's saying he's got it. And I can't. And then eventually I stop and little bit of shame comes in and I'm like a little disgusted and embarrassed and like I wonder if he's gonna want to be with me type of thing. And then I move out of shame. And I think that this is one of the first things that I'll say is to replace our shame or our embarrassment with curiosity as quickly as possible. That's
Mhm.
what I did. I got really curious about what proving my point or needing to be right was trying to protect me from. And I had previously shared a little bit about growing up. I had a dad who was manipulative and a gaslighter and was really psychologically abusive towards my mom, not directed at me, but I observed it. I watched it a lot. He was really quick with his words. He could flip things around, and it was really crazy making for her, quite literally. And so, as a tiny human watching this, I decided that being right was safety and that being wrong was unsafe. Right? Like I just watched it play out over and over. It's like power and control over here. If you're right, you're safe. And if you can't follow and you can't remember things properly and you lose the thread, like it's unsafe for you. That's what I saw play out over and over and over again. And so I became an individual who walked through life needing to be right because that was my way of protecting myself. It was my way of creating safety for myself. So when I followed that trail down into my family of origin, it was like, oh, okay, this makes sense. Of course, when I'm in conflict, I go to this place where I need to be right and I need to prove my point because I'm just trying to be safe. I'm just trying to feel safe in this moment. Now, it's not an excuse. I always say, like, context is not an invitation for excuse, but it's so helpful for us to understand because I was then able to share that story with my partner and say, like, I want to take accountability here. And that I think is really important in conflict too, is for us to see our part in the dance, right? So we're so good at seeing the other person's part always. I see exactly what you did. You got defensive and you did this and da da da, right? To be able to see our part. But I had to go to curiosity first. And I think there's something that happens when we go down a path of curiosity is where a little bit of compassion for ourselves comes in. Because again, if we are remaining self protective, then I need to protect me and not protect the relationship at all. Then I need to defend my position, right? As opposed to holding myself with compassion, which is like, oh my gosh, I was a little girl who watched this go down all the time. No wonder I operate in the world this way. That gave me compassion for myself instead of disgust that I was this adult woman who was operating this way. And so I think when we can find a moment of compassion for ourselves as well as for our partners, right? They were tiny humans in a complicated family system as well, and their behavior makes sense in context as too, right? Then we start to be able to bring a much fuller picture and fuller story forward for one another. Because conflict, it's like some people might be listening and be like, that's a lot of work for just a towel on the bed,
Mhm.
but it isn't, it's like all of these things, even if they feel like these micro moments, like, but I've told you 50,000 times, don't do this. I can't
Mhm.
stand it. Why do you keep doing this? This
Yeah.
is your fault, right? It's like all of this stuff, though, really is tied to things that are historical for us. And if we're ever going to find ourselves out the other side in a different way, because the reality of it is if you're having the same conflict over and over and over again, you obviously haven't changed something.
Right.
Right. Like something is still unresolved. I always say that our unwanted patterns are pain's way of grabbing for our attention, right? It's like, so do you have unwanted patterns in your life? Do you have a conflict that you keep that's reoccurring? It's an arrow that is pointing to something that is unresolved that needs your attention. And so that's the curiosity comes forward, the ability to take ownership and accountability. To remind yourself that if you're seeing yourself as a tiny little human, you also need to see the other person as a tiny little human as well, and to understand the context as much as you can. And
Mhm.
then yeah, I mean, ultimately we have to get to a place where adult to adult, you know, sure, this was beautiful information for me to understand about myself and it was beautiful information for Connor to understand too, but ultimately I can't just go around proving my point and needing to be right forever
Right.
and, trust that this relationship's going to be fine. And so, yeah, there has to be a shift in behavior, but I would say for starters, curiosity needs to replace shame and guilt and embarrassment to really connect to what the behavior is trying to protect. So if you're the person who put the towel on the bed again for the, 50th time, even though your partner has asked you, it's like, eh, are you doing that behavior because you're trying to protect yourself from being controlled and that you grew up in a controlling household, right? It's like we have
Mhm.
to get really curious because otherwise it doesn't make sense otherwise, right? Because you're just like, why do I keep doing this even though it's like a simple ask from my partner,
Right.
right? So we have to get curious. We have to understand the context. We need to be willing to bring it forward. And then we have to shift out of self protection into relational protection. You matter as much as I matter in this moment. Your story is just as important as my story and vice versa. And if we can hold that, then we can move through these moments differently.
Mhm. But what if, like, how do we distinguish if this problem is, like, perpetual or it's solvable? Like, what if it's
Mhm.
just it's a lost cause for a specific thing? I mean, maybe it never is, but what if it is?
Yeah, I think, John Gottman's research shows that, like, I think it's like 69% of, issues are like unsolvable ones, and
Mhm.
so we focus on, the ones that can shift. Yeah, like, part of this is about acceptance. You know, it's like we know that in relationship we're not getting tens out of tens in every moment of every day, right? Like that there are immovable things that will be here. And I think, the goal probably there is, can I get to a place where I can accept what these blocks are, what these limitations are? And like, is the rest of the stuff like meaningful and special and important enough to really supersede that? But it's I think it's like the stuff that cuts us deep to the core. That's where we have more challenging stuff, like as opposed to can you accept that your partner loads the dishwasher differently than you
Right.
do? It's like, well, some people are like, absolutely not. Right. But
Mhm.
like most of us would say, yeah, right. Even if I'm like, ugh, I don't understand why you do it this way. Can't you just do it differently? Or, one of the ones my husband does not like wiping down counters. And I like really want him to like wiping down
Yeah.
counters. But it is a tolerable thing for me, even though it's something that I wish would shift. Right. It's like these are tolerable things, and I think we have to focus on the ones that are like, no, this hurts me deeply,
Right.
right? And like if we can't change some of the stuff that hurts us deeply, right, then maybe we're having a little bit of a different conversation
Right, or
about
maybe
that.
it's just that person and not the thing that hurts you deeply.
Yeah.
Like I have talked about before, I was in a relationship where he never used a coaster and it drove me insane. Like truly insane. And my husband never uses coasters and
Uh-huh.
I don't care at all.
Yeah.
It's just like you have to really, but it's in if you're in it at the
Mhm.
time, you really do think it's about the coasters.
Totally.
Like
Yeah.
you're not aware that it could be the relationship.
Right.
Um, my last question for you, and this one I'm so curious about because potentially, I don't know, maybe we'll be in marriage and family therapy in the coming years.
Mhm.
Um, like, what do you think that the issues will be? Like, what trends or changes do you kind of foresee in the field, especially with more and more things like gentle parenting? Like,
Mhm.
do you think we're gonna see 2 people come in who both think that they're amazing because they've never been told that anything they've ever done as a kid is not okay?
Totally.
So then they're not gonna be able to be in a
Right.
relationship with each other because 'cause they're
Right.
both like, "No, no, no, I'm amazing. My parents have never yelled at me." And the other person's like, "No, no, no, I'm amazing. My parents would never yell at me."
It's hilarious. I don't know that I've ever thought about it that way. I often will ask parents, like, if your child is on their therapist's sofa in 20 years from now, in what way will they describe you? Which I think is a really beautiful question, but I've never really thought about it in like what issues will be presenting for our now babies,
To
20
date,
decades,
yeah.
decades from now. I think, listen, obviously there's such a shift with our social media. I think we are maybe losing a little bit of our ability to be in complexity and nuance, right? And so we're not able to tolerate certain things, and we are very careful in giving feedback. And I think there's sometimes a bit of a fragility around that, where you've heard me so far today, where I'm like, feedback is so important. It's so necessary. We need to be able to like hold ourselves up and hear things. And I think we're losing a little bit of that, where we're not able to hear that we did something that was upsetting or hurtful to another. But ultimately, I think it's going to be still a lot of the same stuff that we're already dealing with. I think loss of self is big, especially with social media. Curious to see how AI is going to affect a lot of things for us in the coming years and coming decades as well. It's like, if you don't need to, if everything is really at your fingertips, like how do you learn? How do you know who you are? Like there's
Right.
just like a lot of outsourcing that I think
Mhm.
will be happening and already is happening, as opposed to, when we were growing up, we didn't have those things at our fingertips. Like I'm always shocked when people are like, I don't know how to write in cursive. I'm like, wait, what? Or like, I don't know how to spell because I always had autocorrect. Right. I'm like,
Mhm.
oh wow. Like right. Like these things that we didn't think about at all. And I'm like struck by them. But I still think the main things that we see are intimacy issues, money issues, right? Having differences around these things, dealing with um, family in laws, and many of the same challenges. But I do think social media, I think AI, I think all of those things will be really fascinating to really see how it plays out and how people have a core sense of themselves and their ability to navigate the world and relationships. When so much of relationship is now through a device or yeah,
Yeah,
right.
yeah,
It's like
that's really interesting.
yeah, it really is, and I do think, we'll probably see more intimacy issues, especially if we are gonna be using AI for relationships. That part really scares me, or this idea that you can have an AI girlfriend, you can have an AI boyfriend, you can have an AI partner,
God.
that stuff is happening, or you can enter into VR and, have a sexual experience there. And it's like POV and you feel like you're right there. And how are these things going to affect we know, and maybe we've studied a lot around porn, for example, but we don't have enough when it comes to this. And I think those types of things are things that, will be strikingly different than, what we see today. So I believe we'll still trend in the same direction with, all of the regular normal issues that
Right.
we have today. But I think this idea around, intimacy and being able to connect human to human, right? Like to have a conversation with a person, to know how to see your way through that for, an hour or longer. Right? Like I don't know that people are going to be able to do that well. And I think, this idea that you can disconnect and then go quote unquote connect elsewhere with someone or something, that is not well, I'll say real in the way that we understand it
Yeah.
today, will be a very interesting
That
space.
freaks me out. I am, like, in denial of that
Yeah, I've
happening.
thought about I bet that there will be a time where therapists will have to train in being able to enter into VR to work
Mm,
with clients who are kind of stuck there, right? Who kind of live there, right? That they're not going to want to have a conversation with a therapist in this world as we know it, but a therapist will have to enter, virtual reality with them and
God.
work with them there.
That's terrifying. I am so scared of that. Okay, we're gonna do some fun rapid fire
Okay.
questions. At what age is your earliest memory? Before 2, after 3, or after 4?
Um, after 3.
Mhm. You personally.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
If you live with your significant other, how often do you go to bed at the same time? Never/rarely, sometimes often, usually always.
Yeah, almost always. Yeah,
Mhm. Would you rather your significant other have ended badly with their ex or amicably?
amicably.
Yeah, I don't know why anyone would choose badly. Have your parents moved out of your childhood home? Yes or no?
My dad still lives in my childhood home, and my mom lives in the home that after the divorce
Mhm.
that we had. Yes.
Mhm. How many close, as in hang out solo comfortably, female
Mm.
friends does your significant other have? None, 1 to 2, 2 to 4, or 4 plus?
Probably 1 to 2, but they
Mhm.
don't live close by.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mhm. Do you know anyone who cheated on their partner when they were, like, boyfriend, girlfriend, let's say, girlfriend, girlfriend, whatever, and now they're married to them, like, happily?
I know clients who have.
Mhm.
Do I know anybody personally?
It's so interesting, like, would you say like, if you had a client that had cheated
Uh-huh.
when they were dating, and then they were like, "Hi, Vienna," or whatever they
Yeah.
call you,
Yeah. Yeah. They
I
call
would
me.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
"I would like to propose." Would you be like, "Oh god, but you've cheated?"
It depend no, but it depends on whether it's been reconciled. It
Mhm.
really, really
Yeah.
depends on the work that happens there. Because I don't think that once a cheater, always a cheater. I think
Mhm.
there's a tremendous amount of growth. I think it can be true that if you don't
Mhm.
look at these things and you don't actually do any work to repair and reconcile, the part of you that's engaged in that,
Yeah.
then likely you're gonna, continue to engage that way. But I've worked with so many people people where there's been infidelity, and, there's a beautiful growth that comes from the relationship. So no, it's not something that would strike me as, "Oh my gosh, what are you talking about?" But if it's never been spoken about, or there hasn't been any resolution around it, then that would be some cause for, concern or
Yeah, yeah.
alarm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
of course. That's interesting.
Yeah, I don't think I have any friends who not anybody
I
that's
think
come
for
and
me,
called
it's
out.
more like the couples that were young when they got
Yeah,
together, because that's just more common to, like,
totally.
that behavior when young.
Yeah.
Not that it's okay, but,
Yeah,
it's
there's a
just more
history there. We're
common.
really, we're immature,
Mhm.
and, um, yeah, I mean, it's like there's we don't necessarily have the tools or the wisdom or the emotional maturity to navigate some of the things that are showing up for
Yeah.
us. And yeah, like sometimes it plays out in infidelity, and sometimes it plays out in other behavior that feels immature. And I'm not suggesting that all infidelity is immature, but it's like there's, or maybe like it how do I want to say this? Like there's a there's a knowing of the self, there's a disconnect from the self, I
Right,
think,
right,
right?
because you don't know yourself,
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
before you're, like,
It
30
takes us a
probably.
while.
Yeah. This has been so fun. Vienna, can you leave us with a quote or piece of advice, maybe something from the book or just something that you like to share with clients?
Yeah. Oh, I've got so many things. Yeah. Well, one thing that I've said already today that I think is worth repeating is that you make sense in context. I think that that's really important, because sometimes we're so confused, like, why do I do this? Or I can't, I'm so annoyed, or I keep making promises to myself that I can't, uphold. And we get very frustrated with ourselves. But I think this like reminder that we make sense in context is so important for us to bring that compassion in. One of the most important questions that a therapist ever asked me, and something that I share in the book, is, when you think back, my work obviously is about understanding our family systems and how that stuff is plays out in our adult relationships. And it's certainly not an invitation to like hang out in our past forever, but this idea of, what did I need most as a child and not get? And to really sit with that question, and not, oh, everything, I was fine. All our fine folk probably want to say, I got it all. It was good. But to really answer that question as honestly as possible, right? To begin to tune into where we need to give ourselves attention.
Mhm.
And then one of the exercises right at the end of the book that is from a psychotherapist, Michael Kerr, that I really appreciate is, to think of your mother as your grandmother's daughter and see how the perspective changes. And I think that's a beautiful reminder, again, not for excuse making, not to let anybody off the hook, but this reminder, right? Like, okay, what if I was able to think of you, right, as, your mother's daughter? If I was able to think of this other my partner in this way, like, what shifts then when I can see you as a tiny human in a complex system? So maybe I'll sign off with that.
I love that. Awesome. Thank you so much. Where can everybody find you, read your book, listen
Yeah.
to your podcast?
Yeah, I'm Mindful MFT on Instagram, and yeah, pretty much everything that I have going on is there. But yes, the Origins of You: How Breaking Family Patterns Can Liberate the Way We Live and Love is available anywhere you get your books. And then This Keeps Happening is my podcast where I speak with anonymous guests about any challenges that they're facing, individuals, couples, patterns that they're in. It's a 1 hour, one time conversation, which is really interesting and very different than therapy, because they're, strangers and I know nothing about them. But it's fascinating and so beautiful to see what can happen when you sit down with someone and have an honest conversation. So,
Awesome.
yeah,
Thank you so much.
thank you.
That was so